Well, you gotta give it to them. It really is fascinating just how deep and how wide the ideological roots of the Chinese Communist Party has spread across the globe, including in Canada. The question is, what type of fruit will blossom from such infiltration, especially when it appears to be targeting our most malleable, our children? Drea Humphrey here with Rebel News, and if you have been following some of our reports at rebelnews.com, then you know that President Xi Jinping's quest to increase his communist government's influence over the entire world is well on its way. Despite the CCP's immense disregard for human life, including the persecution of Falun Gong, Christians, Muslim Uyghurs, as well as the illegal detainment of the innocent like Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, education leaders have allowed the Chinese government to control Confucius Institutes and install teachers and teaching materials in our publicly funded schools and host students and all expense-paid trips, as reported by Vancouver Sun. So what's the big deal, you ask? Well, that's a good question. For example, the BC government shows courses through the CI that are simply labeled as language proficiency tests. Where's the harm in that? Well, if you recall, during a recent anti-CCP protest that I covered, I asked one of the event speakers, named Sherry, what her opinion was on if many of the Canadians that are believing that communism is a rising threat to Canada, if they were correct, and here was her answer.
Clearly, communism is here because China has really close ties with Canada. So whether it's business, whether it's government, whether it's even freedom of speech, China even has set up schools here called Confucius Institutes to spread their propaganda. So it's very much in our backyard, even suppressing free speech.
Now, it does appear that public outcry and disapproval of Confucius Institutes, primarily by Chinese Canadians, seems to have had an effect. True Northeast reported that the British Columbia Institute of Technology, BCIT, was the first Canadian organization to partner with the Confucius Institute, yet in the summer of 2019, it quietly closed its Confucius Institute, citing negative press and declining demand. But even after that victory to anti-CCP activists, Confucius ideology seems to still be running strong, in particular in the School District 43, located in Coquitlam, BC. It has been very loyal to the CI. A recent report done by the Globe and Mail explains that Beijing has used influence over BC schools to push its agenda and keep tabs on Canadian politics. Additionally, that the school district signed off on terms that give Beijing wide latitude to evaluate instruction and demand respect for Chinese cultural custom and terminate its outpouring of money if Coquitlam damages the image of the program. Image of the program or image of China's government? I wonder. To better assess just how much of a concern CCP-backed Confucius Institutes are to Canadians in 2020, I interviewed author and film director Dorius Liu. Dorius has investigated the influence of Confucius Institutes for years and has come up and close and personal with School District 43 regarding just that. I personally learned a lot from her documentary called In the Name of Confucius. It exposes how China's demand for communist ideology to be the only ideology has been aided by propaganda that's intended to indoctrinate students via Confucius Institutes. Take a look at the interview.
I left China for Canada in the pursuit of freedom, democracy, human rights, all those good values that we unfortunately lack in China. So I wanted to, as a Canadian now, I wanted to defend, if anything, from the communist Chinese regime wanted to, sort of infiltrate Canada. I think I have the responsibility to defend that. So that's the first why I wanted to dive into this Confucius Institute controversy. I after a quick Google search, I found it's so much controversy surrounding this. I'm sure just like you were just brought to awareness to this issue. That was exactly how I felt. I think I thought to myself that it's so serious, those issues: academic freedom, integrity, human rights, right, propaganda, and even national security. Each one of them, it's so fundamental to us. So I wanted to find out what exactly the Confucius Institutes are all about, and share my findings with perhaps audiences. So I've been doing that in the past 7 or so years, making film in 3 years, and then traveling with a film around the world, trying to use my film, raise awareness. Yeah.
Why do you think Canada is kind of the place where this is really getting a lot of, we're seeing a lot of influence from them?
In terms of why Canada is so inviting to Confucius Institute, I think, to my understanding, Canadians are very friendly. We also we value multiculturalism in our society. So, and also China is the second largest trading partner, just behind the United States, right? So I think from cultural aspect, from the nature of the Canadian people, we're friendly, we value the multiculturalism, and also from very pragmatic aspect to establish a better or even more friendly, although we are already friendly with relationship with China. So we wanted to do better, and so that maybe we can benefit from this good relationship in trade and in trade. So we eyes on the eyes on the Chinese market as well. So from very different angles. And I guess in the early years, after the Confucius Institutes were invented and by the Chinese government, there was always some sort of criticism or concerns, or maybe better word, concerns surrounding this program. But in the early years, it's very weak, and not many people heard about that. So I think as Canadian educators, we didn't pay much attention, just like myself. We didn't know behind this very friendly gesture, there's something sinister, or if we wish to use the word sinister, or hidden agenda behind that. Then people around the world, especially the neighbors in our South, the Americans, they paid much attention to these threats posed by the Confucius Institute. So here in Canada, I don't think our government or our public has been paying enough attention to this threats posed by the Confucius Institute. So I wanted to, through media coverage like yours, like many others, more Canadian people will be brought attention to this issue, and so that we can voice out our concerns to our elected politicians.
In very recent days, an influence in School District 43 in Coquitlam, BC. That's a city I'm very familiar with, and that the influence is happening in the after-school program. So what would you say to people that don't really fully understand what the actual outcome would potentially be if we let this type of institute run wild, and B, to the ones who were concerned about it but aren't so much concerned anymore?
I just wanted to give one example, maybe a story. While I was doing research for my documentary, that was in 2013, and I found on the Chinese government's official side, the Hanban side, Coquitlam School Board once held a picture exhibition about Tibet. Those pictures, as you could imagine, are showing beautiful landscapes of Tibet and happy faces of Tibetan people. And those pictures were all from Xinhua News Agency. And Xinhua News Agency is well known as the Chinese Communist Party's mouthpiece.
Yeah.
So no, there's no surprise you see just the so-called positive side of the Tibet, but they would not ever show you the real Tibet, where we have already known more than 100 Tibetan people or monks set themselves on fire just in very extreme protest, right, to the Chinese government's heavy-handed ruling or invasion, if you wish. Imagine your kids enrolling in Coquitlam School Board 6 years or even longer than that. Every year, each semester, you would probably your kids will be exposed to those purposefully distorted and sometimes even lied or changed so-called history or current situation about China. What impression your kid will come out about China? And is that impression about China correctly reflect the real picture of China? I think that's dangerous. And that's exactly what the Chinese government wanted to achieve through those Confucius Institute program, which is, in the words of our Canada Security and Intelligence Services word, to win hearts and minds of Canadians. And let alone, as I mentioned, the human rights part. The Chinese government, in order to running Confucius Institutes program, they need to hire Chinese language instructors from China's university and colleges. So as I was filming on Coquitlam campus, there was one Chinese director. She herself was a professor of China South Normal University, if I'm correct. That's a partner university or educational institution with the Coquitlam School Board. They were matched by China's Hanban under Education Ministry. So that's a governmental office. They match one Chinese university with Coquitlam and hire Chinese instructors from that Chinese university to support the Confucius Institute in Coquitlam. That Chinese professor refused to answer so-called sensitive questions, because I did also an interview, very brief interview with her. Right. And I just asked, since you are teaching after school and weekend class, you could have adults as your students. So what if your students asked you about some political things or so-called, I remember I used the words so-called sensitive issues about China. I asked in a very mild way. And she immediately said, "Oh no, we don't talk about those." Right. They don't. And then later she felt very uncomfortable just for that part of conversation or interview, and then she found a way to take back her interview consent. So I could not use her interview. Wow. And she also said she would report. Oh, actually, as I was interviewing then Coquitlam School Board Chair Melissa, together with the current Superintendent Patricia Garland, I interviewed those two ladies at the same time. So you could see that segment in my film. As I was doing the interview, that Chinese director was filming me doing interview from my back, using her iPhone. And also she told me she would report it back to Hanban, back to Beijing. Hanban is in Beijing. Report it back to her boss about my interview. So basically a threat right there. Yeah, a threat right there. I didn't feel very well. No. Why do you think, in comparison with the atrocities that are happening in China, whether it be from the Uyghurs, what's happened
to Tibet, what's happening to Hong Kong, what's been happening to Christians for years. Why do you think we see such a strong movement since George Floyd, but not so much attention on China's government?
The most important reason as to why people react so weak to, horrible human atrocities happening in China. So many different group of people are under persecution by this Chinese Communist Party. I think mostly is our media are not covering enough, or not paying enough attention to what's going on in China. First, and second, we didn't really understand what's happening in China. I mean, specific human rights violations to different groups, as you mentioned, and you forgot to mention the Falun Gong group.
Right.
Anyway, why those human rights atrocities happening in China related to us? Why that matter to us as Canadians? We are not persecuted directly, right, by the Chinese government. So people don't really think of those things. So I think that's the most important reason. To me, I think now more and more media, Western media, are starting to covering the Uyghur situation. Tibet is a issue with longer history. Yeah. And the Falun Gong is not much covered. And the Christian, now more and more media pay attention to Christian persecuted. I think that's positive development as to more media coverage. What's the relationship of us intellectually or on paper? Theoretically, we know, one injustice anywhere is injustice to all everywhere. We know that, right, on paper. Yeah, exactly. But how that related to us? I think if you have a made in China product, say clothes, right, you immediately will feel, that could be produced by blood and sweat, very poor environmental labor, very poor protected labors, or labor camps, even labor camps, or Uyghur peoples, or prisoners of conscience, and that's also still just morality, related to our morality. But nowadays, I find people becoming very pragmatic. Meaning, many times the morality plays less important role in our society or in our daily life. So, but what are the pragmatic relationship? I think I would like to use the pandemic as an instant example. We never thought this could happen. Right. Even after 17 years ago, when SARS hit, I was in China back then. I haven't immigrated to Canada. I heard Canadian nurses in our front, we sacrificed a lot. Even after that, we couldn't imagine something like this COVID-19 pandemic could hit us so hardly. And that's the direct relationship of, if you neglect what's going on in China, if you allow the Chinese Communist Party to doing what he has been doing to its people for 1 years, or even longer than that. And the retribution, that's the word, will come to us eventually. Yeah. The Chinese government covered up the pandemic in early days, and they allowed people who have confirmed or potentially carry the virus to travel around the world. Absolutely. Even though they know that, right? Even though they knew that. So that very bad regime in China, ruling China badly, and then the morality in China is deterioration very rapidly, and Chinese people themselves have much lower moral standard nowadays comparing to just maybe 2 decades ago.
Right.
So people will not, I mean, some of the Chinese people, they will not think, they will not regulate themselves properly. So they travel to other countries, even though they know they could potentially carry viruses. So I think that's the to those who value moral or morality less, value immediate interest more. This is a very hard lessons we have to learn. The pandemic. Right. So I think that's why we should really care about, pay attention to, and not only that, but also voice out our concerns and fight back to the Chinese Communist regime. That is also the way we could also better protect ourselves.
I think my last question to you in closing would be, what would you have to say to Justin Trudeau and our government about where our relationship with China should be heading?
To be honest, I think Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been very weak in dealing with the communist China. I think I wanted to say this to Mr. Trudeau. Please see Chinese Communist Party as it is, not as a trading partner, not as the ruler of the world's largest market, not as a strong man that you don't want to offense, not as your friend, for sure. To see Chinese Communist regime as the enemy of Canada and enemy of Canadian people, because Chinese Communist Party is the enemy of our universal values.
Have you read China Virus by Ezra Levant yet? It's about how Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's loyalty to China is putting Canadians at risk. It's a message that more Canadians need to hear, and you can grab your copy at chinavirusbook.com.